Picture the scene. It's 1692. You wake before dawn in Salem Village, Massachusetts. Your breath visible in the freezing air as wood smoke curls from neighboring chimneys after morning prayers. You sit down to a humble breakfast. Rye bread. Maybe some porridge. Nothing fancy. But as you tear into that dark, crusty loaf, you don't notice the slightly discolored kernels baked inside. They look a bit odd. Sure, darker and misshapen, but probably just sun-damaged, nothing to worry about, right? That innocent breakfast decision is about to help trigger one of history's most bizarre social collapses within months. 200 people will be accused of witchcraft, 30 found guilty, 19 hanged, and one man slowly crushed to death under heavy stones. So today we're asking, was it poisoned grain mass hysteria, Puritan extremism, or local power struggles that caused the Salem witch trials? And more importantly, if you were there, would you have survived? Let's start with what was actually on your plate in 1692, Salem Village. And trust me, it wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, if you were a typical colonist. Your diet revolved around one particular grain, rye. It was cheap, it was hardy, and it grew surprisingly well in the harsh, unpredictable climate of New England. Wheat was more expensive and finicky, so rye became the bread and butter, quite literally, of Massachusetts colonial life. You'd find it in your morning porridge, your daily bread, and pretty much everything else that filled your stomach. But here's where things get dangerous. Lurking within those golden stalks of rye was something most farmers had absolutely no idea existed, a parasitic fungus called Claviceps purpurea, better known as ergot. This sneaky little organism doesn't just grow on rye, it actually replaces individual grain kernels with its own dark purplish-brown growths called sclerotia. Imagine picking an ear of rye and finding among the normal seeds these strange misshapen lumps that look almost burnt or withered. They're slightly larger than regular grains, with a curved shape that vaguely resembles a rooster's spur, which is actually where the name ergot comes from, the old French word for spur. Now here's the terrifying part. A 17th century farmer had absolutely no way of knowing what this stuff actually was. No microscopes, no understanding of fungal biology, nothing. When they saw these dark, discolored kernels mixed in with their harvest, they'd simply assume it was sun damage or some natural variation in the crop. Certainly nothing worth worrying about, and definitely nothing worth throwing away. Food was far too precious for that. So into the storage it went, along with all the healthy grain waiting to be processed into flour and eventually into your breakfast. The timing of Salem's outbreak lines up disturbingly well with the ergot theory in 1691. The year before the witch trials began, farmers across Salem Village planted their rye in autumn and harvested it the following summer. This grain would then be stored in barns until around November, when it was finally processed and distributed throughout the community. That puts contaminated rye hitting people's tables somewhere between December 1691 and January 1692, the exact same month that the strange symptoms in Salem began to appear. Coincidence, maybe, but the connections don't stop there. Ergot absolutely thrives in very specific weather conditions. It loves rainy springs, followed by hot, stormy summers. This combination creates the perfect humid environment for the fungus to flourish and spread throughout a crop, and wouldn't you know? Historical records suggest that Salem experienced exactly these conditions in the growing season of 1691. The weather was essentially rolling out a red carpet for ergot to infect as much rye as possible. Dr. Linda Caporal of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute first proposed this theory back in 1976, and she went even further, attempting to identify exactly where the contaminated grain originated. She pointed to the Putnams, a wealthy Protestant farming family, who would go on to play a central role in the witch trials as successful farmers. The Putnams paid taxes not just in money, but in provisions, goods like pork, butter, corn, and rye. Reverend Samuel Parris, a close friend and neighbor, received around 2/3 of his salary in these provisions, and since the Putnams owned the most land and grew the biggest crops, they ended up supplying a large portion of what ended up in the Parris household pantry. This creates a direct pathway from potentially infected Putnam fields to Parris family bellies. And remember who showed symptoms? First, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, the young girls living directly in that household, eating that bread every single day. The pieces start to fit together almost too neatly. The contaminated harvest, the perfect growing conditions, the timing, the direct supply chain from farm to victim. But nobody in Salem had any clue what ergot was, let alone that it might be slowly poisoning them. When they saw those weird-looking grains, they shrugged and carried on. Because what else would you do? Isn't that right? There is perhaps the most chilling part of this whole story. The people of Salem never even knew what might have been making them sick. But what exactly happens when you eat this stuff? When ergot enters your body, it doesn't mess around. This fungus contains a cocktail of toxic compounds called ergot alkaloids. And once they start building up in your system, things get ugly fast. There are actually two forms of ergotism. You really don't want either of them. The first is gangrenous ergotism. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. The alkaloids cause your blood vessels to constrict so severely that blood flow to your extremities. Basically stops your fingers, toes. Hands and feet begin to die from lack of circulation. They turn black and eventually fall off. Medieval Europeans called this condition St. Anthony's fire, and it killed thousands across the continent. But the second form, convulsive ergotism, is what concerns us in Salem. This version attacks your nervous system rather than your circulation, and the symptoms are genuinely terrifying without getting too technical. Here's what happens. The ergot, alkaloids, ergotamine and dihydroergotamine start accumulating in your body. These compounds bind to receptors in your brain, causing blood vessels to narrow, which triggers a cascade of increasingly disturbing effects. It starts with flu-like symptoms. You feel weak, feverish, maybe some nausea. Nothing that would immediately alarm you, but then come the muscle spasms. Involuntary twitches at first, then full-blown convulsions. Your body contorting in ways you can't control. Your limbs jerking and thrashing without your permission. And here's where things get really interesting. Ergot alkaloids. You contain something called lysergic acid. This compound might ring a bell because it forms the chemical foundation of what we now know as LSD. Yes, that LSD, the psychedelic drug that became famous in the 1960s for fundamentally altering human consciousness and perception. So imagine ingesting a natural precursor to one of the most powerful hallucinogens ever discovered, except you have absolutely no idea what's happening to you or why. The mental effects can be profound and disturbing. Changes in perception, where sounds seem distorted and images appear to warp and shift, paranoia creeping in, making you suspicious of everyone around you. Delusions taking hold, convincing you of things that simply aren't real. Psychotic episodes where you lose touch with reality entirely, and perhaps most significantly, vivid hallucinations, both visual and auditory. You might see things that aren't there, hear voices that don't exist, watch shadows move in impossible ways. Your mind playing tricks that feel absolutely undeniably real. Now imagine experiencing all of this in 1692. Puritan Massachusetts. You have no framework for understanding what's happening, no concept of fungal poisoning or hallucinogenic compounds or neurological disruption. All you know is that your body is convulsing against your will and you're seeing terrifying visions of things that shouldn't exist. What explanation would make sense to you? In that context, the supernatural would seem not just possible, but obvious. Something evil must be doing this to you. Here's another crucial detail. Children and teenagers are significantly more susceptible to ergot poisoning than adults. There are several reasons for this. Their smaller bodies mean higher concentrations of toxic alkaloids relative to their body mass. Their immune systems and nervous systems are still developing, making them more vulnerable to disruption, and their faster metabolic rates mean they absorb toxins more quickly than grown adults would. This is important because remember who first showed symptoms in Salem? 2 young girls aged 9 and 11. Picture what it might have felt like for Betty Paris that January morning. A creeping sense of wrongness spreading through your small body, your muscles starting to twitch and spasm beyond your control, strange shapes forming at the edges of your vision, voices whispering things that make no sense, the world around you becoming unstable, untrustworthy, terrifying. You're screaming, but you don't know why you're hiding under furniture trying to escape something. You can't even name you're making sounds that don't seem human because nothing about what's happening to you seems human. Fits contortions, screaming visions of specters, barking like dogs hiding under furniture. Does any of this sound familiar? It should, because these are the exact symptoms documented in Salem that January. Symptoms that would soon be attributed to witchcraft and demonic possession. But what if they were actually the result of contaminated breakfast? Now let's look at exactly who got sick first and why that matters enormously. It all started in January 1692, inside the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the local Puritan minister. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began behaving in ways that terrified everyone around them. These weren't subtle changes we're talking about, dramatic, disturbing symptoms. That seemed to come out of nowhere. The girls had violent fits. They screamed in pain and threw objects across the room. They were found contorted on the ground in positions that seemed physically impossible. They hid under furniture as if trying to escape something invisible, and perhaps most disturbingly, they barked like dogs. Reverend Parris, being a deeply religious man, did what any good Puritan would do. First, he prayed hard for his daughter and niece, begging God to deliver them from whatever evil had taken hold. But all the praying in the world didn't stop the girls from their terrifying behavior. So Parris realized he needed backup. He called in a local doctor and another minister named John Hale to examine the children, and what they found shocked them. Reverend Hale later reported that these children were bitten and pinched by invisible agents. Their arms, necks, and backs turned this way and that way and returned back again, so it was impossible for them to do of themselves. To a 17th century Puritan minister, there was really only one explanation for what he was witnessing. Witchcraft, demonic possession, some form of supernatural evil had clearly targeted these innocent children. What other conclusion could possibly make sense? But if we applied Dr. Linda Caporal's ergotism theory, a very different picture emerges. Remember the Putnam family, those wealthy Protestant farmers with the biggest crops in Salem Village? They paid a significant portion of Reverend Parris's salary in provisions, including rye grain that would have been harvested in summer 1691, stored until November, and then delivered to the Parris household just in time for winter. This creates a direct contamination pathway from potentially ergot-infected Putnam fields straight to the breakfast table of Betty and Abigail. Two young girls whose small bodies and developing nervous systems made them especially vulnerable to ergot poisoning. If the theory is correct, those innocent morning meals of rye bread and porridge were slowly building up toxic alkaloids in their systems until the symptoms finally exploded that January. But why didn't the adults in the Parris household get sick too? At the time, this was explained away by religious reasoning. Reverend Parris was a holy man too strong in faith to be afflicted by demonic forces. But Betty and Abigail, being young female and not priests, made much easier targets for the devil's work. Convenient explanation, but Caporal offers a scientific alternative. We now know that children absorb toxins faster. Than adults, their smaller bodies result in higher concentrations relative to their body mass, and their still developing immune and nervous systems are more easily disrupted. An adult eating the same contaminated bread might experience only mild symptoms or none at all, while a child could be dramatically affected. Shortly after Betty and Abigail fell ill, another young girl began exhibiting similar symptoms, 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. And here's where the connection becomes even more intriguing. Ann was a member of the Putnam household, the very family suspected of supplying the contaminated grain she would have been eating from the same harvest as Betty and Abigail, exposed to the same potential source of ergot poisoning. 3 young girls, all connected to the same grain supply, all showing the same terrifying symptoms within weeks of each other. Before all this strangeness began, the girls had been caught experimenting with something called umancy, an illicit fortune-telling practice involving eggs mirrors and attempts to see visions of the future, specifically their future husbands. This practice, used by ancient Greeks and Vikings, had become something of a forbidden craze in Massachusetts. The girls were reportedly trying to conjure romantic visions, but instead one of them saw something terrifying: a coffin, an omen, perhaps of the death and chaos about to engulf their community. Reverend Paris demanded to know who taught them this forbidden practice, and that question would soon lead to the first accusation of witchcraft. When Reverend Paris demanded to know who had taught his daughter and niece that forbidden egg, divination, the girls gave him an answer. Tituba, the family's enslaved servant Tituba, had lived in Barbados before being transported to Salem and sold to the Paris household. Her background was wholly mysterious to most of Salem's longtime residents, making her an easy target for suspicion. She had no social standing, no money, and no power to defend herself in a Puritan court. An accusation of witchcraft against someone like her would prove almost impossible to fight. But Tituba wasn't accused alone. Two other women were quickly swept up in the initial wave of accusations: Sarah Good, a poverty-stricken homeless woman who begged in the local streets, and Sarah Osborne, a similarly poor elderly woman who rarely attended church. All three shared something crucial: they existed on the margins of Salem society. They were vulnerable, powerless, and in the eyes of their Puritan neighbors already suspect. Accusations against them seemed almost designed to target those least able to resist. What happened next changed everything when Tituba was brought before the court. She did something unexpected. Instead of protesting her innocence, she confessed over 3 extraordinary days. She told a wild tale that gave the court exactly what it wanted to hear. She described seeing a man in black who had forced her to sign her name in the devil's book, making her his servant. She claimed that Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and 6 unnamed others had done the same. She spoke of Sarah Good sending yellow birds to attack the 2 afflicted girls, and a cat scratching another victim. Her testimony earned her the nickname the Black Witch of Salem among the community. Why would Tituba confess to something that could get her killed? Perhaps she was delirious from imprisonment and interrogation. Perhaps she understood something crucial about how these trials worked. Perhaps she was simply trying to survive, because here's the twisted logic of Salem's justice system. If you were accused of witchcraft, you could plead guilty or innocent, and surprisingly, the majority chose guilty. A guilty plea usually resulted in jail time, while an innocent plea almost always meant execution. The reasoning was pure Puritan logic. Lying was considered a grave sin, and since the town had already decided you were probably a witch before your trial, even began pleading innocent meant you were obviously lying about your guilt, which meant you had committed another sin on top of being a witch, and therefore deserved to die. But a guilty plea demonstrated remorse and repentance, good Christian traits that showed you could still be saved. So confessing, even to something you didn't do, was often the smartest survival strategy. With Tituba's explosive confession, the floodgates opened. Salem descended into what can only be described as a vicious whirlwind of collective madness that would last over a year. More people came forward, accusing anyone they didn't quite fancy, anyone who had wronged them, anyone who seemed different or suspicious. Husbands accused wives. Siblings turned on each other. Lifelong friends became bitter enemies. Overnight, the accusations spread through the community like an epidemic of suspicion, infecting everything they touched. Not even children were safe. The youngest person to be accused and arrested was 5-year-old Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah. Good, imagine being 5 years old, dragged from your home, thrown into a cold, dark prison, accused of conspiring with the devil. All because your mother was poor and unpopular. Dorothy was eventually released, but she would watch her mother hang from the gallows. The trauma of those events reportedly left her mentally damaged for the rest of her life. Of course, not everyone in Salem supported the trials. Some residents watched in horror as their community tore itself apart. But opposing the witch hunt was incredibly dangerous. Only a very brave or very foolish person would stick their neck out, because doing so would likely result in being accused of witchcraft themselves. The whole situation had become a self-perpetuating nightmare, where questioning the existence of witches was itself evidence of witchcraft. So what was really driving this madness? Was it ergot poisoning or something far more human? Here's where we need to pump the brakes a little. Because as neat as the ergotism theory sounds, it doesn't come without some serious problems when Dr. Caporiel first proposed the idea. In 1976, it captured public imagination almost immediately. Finally, a scientific explanation for one of history's strangest events. But scholars and historians quickly started poking holes in the theory, and some of their arguments are pretty compelling. The first major issue is the symptoms themselves. Convulsive ergotism typically causes gastrointestinal problems like diarrhea and vomiting, as well as something called livid skin, where your extremities appear discolored or bruised from poor circulation. But these symptoms were never reported in Salem. The afflicted girls had fits and visions, sure, but nobody mentioned the digestive issues or skin discoloration that usually accompany ergot poisoning defenders of the Ya. The theory argued that ergotism presents differently in different cases. Not every symptom appears every time, but critics say the absence of these telltale signs makes ergot an unlikely culprit. Then there's the hallucination problem. Yes, ergot contains lysergic acid, a precursor to LSD, and yes, this can cause hallucinations. But here's the thing, typical hallucinogenic experiences involve vague distortions of perception, sounds, seem strange, images appear. Warped, time feels different. What generally doesn't happen is consistent, detailed visions of specific people wearing recognizable faces. The afflicted girls in Salem didn't just see random shapes or colors. They claimed to see the specters of their neighbors, often people they had personal grudges against. That's not how hallucinogens typically work. Perhaps the most damaging criticism involves the selective nature of the illness. Historically confirmed outbreaks of ergotism affected entire populations, not just scattered individuals between 900 and 1300 AD. Gangrenous ergotism killed over 50,000 people across southern France. Whole communities were devastated by the disease outbreaks in Russia, Denmark, and Germany during the Middle Ages. Similarly affected massive numbers of people even as recently as 1951. A contaminated batch of flour from a single bakery in France affected 250 people and killed 5. Compare that to Salem, where only a handful of people initially showed symptoms if the grain supply was contaminated. Why didn't more people get sick? Why were the afflictions concentrated among specific individuals rather than spreading through everyone who ate the same bread? The theory suggests children were more susceptible, but only 3. Tracet of the afflicted Betty Abigail and Anne Jr. were under 14. Most others were older, which undermines the age-based explanation. Salem historians Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum offered a completely different theory, one based on economics politics and good old-fashioned human pettiness. In the years before the trials, tensions had been building between conservative Salem Village and the rapidly modernizing Salem town. The villagers were religious farmers resistant to change, while the townspeople were embracing commerce and international trade. This created a geographical and ideological divide that split the community. The Putnams represented the old guard traditional religious, deeply suspicious of change. The Porters, one of the village's most influential families, represented the new progressive faction they openly campaigned against. Reverend Paris, and even managed to cut his salary in 1691. The Putnams' close friends with Paris were furious. This wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a generations-long family feud dressed in religious clothing. When Boyer and Nissenbaum mapped the accusations, they found something striking. The accusers generally lived in the rural western part of the village, while the accused tended to live closer to Salem town in the more prosperous east. The witch trials weren't random. They followed existing fault lines of resentment and rivalry. Look at who got accused. Bridget Bishop, an outspoken tavern owner who wore fancy clothes. Sarah Good, a homeless woman with a bitter husband. Sarah Osborne, who had married her servant. These weren't random targets. They were people who had already violated Puritan social norms. But here's the thing, alternative theory has problems too. Later scholars questioned whether the geographical divide was really as clear as Boyer and Nissenbaum suggested. The map might have been oversimplified. So if it wasn't just ergot, and it wasn't just politics, what really happened in Salem? To truly understand Salem, we need to step back and look at what life was actually like in 1692 Massachusetts, because these people weren't living in peaceful times. They were terrified long before anyone mentioned witchcraft. The colony had only been established 6 decades earlier, in 1626, and many Salem residents were recent arrivals from England who had crossed an ocean seeking religious freedom, specifically the right to practice Puritanism in its strictest form. But what they found in New England wasn't exactly paradise. The colony was surrounded by ocean on one side and Moore's vast threatening wilderness on all others. There was little law and order, constant infighting among colonists, and the ever-present threat of attack from Native Americans. Just a decade before the witch trials in 1676, a brutal 15-year conflict between settlers and the local indigenous population had finally ended. This war killed 1 out of every 10 adult men in the colonies and destroyed countless homes and businesses. The trauma was still fresh, the fear still raw. Every Sunday, Salem residents would stand in church listening to Puritan sermons that spoke vividly of the devil and the dangers lurking beyond their fences. Their ministers painted pictures of a world where Satan was constantly scheming, where evil spirits roamed the wilderness, where eternal damnation awaited those who strayed from righteousness. For most colonists, the only comfort came from gathering around the fire at night, sharing stories from the Bible tales of witchcraft demons and the importance of vigilance against the forces of darkness. So when 2 young girls started convulsing and screaming about invisible tormentors, the community was primed to believe the worst they had been taught their entire lives, that the devil was real, that witches existed, that supernatural evil could strike at any moment. The accusations weren't just believed, they were expected. This was a population ripe for exactly this kind of mass hysteria, waiting for a spark to ignite their deepest fears. The trials lasted just over a year, and in that time, Salem tore itself apart. Around 200 people were accused of witchcraft, 30 were found guilty, 14 women and 5 men were hanged, and in one particularly gruesome case, a farmer named Giles. Corey was slowly pressed to death under heavy stones when he refused to enter a plea. Even 2 dogs were executed, apparently when your dog starts acting strangely during a witch panic. Not even man's best friend is safe. But by September 1692, something began to shift. Public support for the trials was waning. The sheer number of accusations, many obviously based on personal grudges and petty disputes, became impossible for even true believers to ignore. The trials had created massive disruption. Crops were neglected, families destroyed. The community plunged into chaos. Perhaps most significantly, accusations started reaching too high when charges based on spectral evidence were raised against the governor's own wife. Suddenly, the rules changed. In early October, the prominent minister Increase Mather publicly condemned spectral evidence, arguing it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person be condemned. Governor Phipps, who had allowed the trials to continue unchecked, suddenly found religion on the matter. Spectral evidence was officially banned, and since most cases relied entirely on claims of ghosts and spirits, the whole system collapsed. 49 people were released from prison, the special court was dissolved, and further arrests were prohibited. The hysteria ended almost as quickly as it had begun, and here lies perhaps the strongest argument for ergotism. If the contaminated grain supply had been consumed by late 1692, the symptoms would naturally subside. New healthy crops would replace the tainted ones, and the visions would simply stop, which is exactly what happened. The fits ceased, the specters vanished, and Salem was left to reckon with what it had. It took centuries for full accountability. In 1700, 3 convicted women who hadn't yet been executed were pardoned, relatives of victims received compensation, and finally in 2001, Massachusetts officially exonerated every single person convicted at Salem, because apparently it took 300 years to conclusively determine that magic isn't actually real. So after all this evidence and counter-evidence, what really caused the Salem witch trials? So was ergotism the real cause of the Salem witch trials? The honest answer is, we'll probably never know for certain. The theory provides a compelling explanation for some symptoms, particularly among those first afflicted girls eating from potentially contaminated Putnam grain. But it doesn't account for everything. The selective nature of the illness, the specific detailed accusations, the convenient targeting of social outcasts and family enemies. What we can say is this: Salem wasn't caused by any single factor, it was a perfect storm. Ergot poisoning may have provided the initial spark, but fear, ignorance, religious extremism, economic tensions, family feuds, and plain human cruelty fanned those flames into an inferno that consumed an entire community, and perhaps that's the most terrifying lesson of all. It didn't take magic to destroy Salem, just ordinary people making ordinary decisions based on fear, and that could happen anywhere, even today,